Wow, it sounded like it was to me, but thank you. Y'all could have hollered that from the back. So that's kind of the way these guys were, is, I don't know that this new guy should be getting the same amount as I get. And so the owner basically has a conversation with them and says, look, guys, didn't I offer to pay you this, and didn't you agree to work for that? Yes. Okay. Why are you upset that I'm giving these other people that didn't work as much the same thing? That's just my generosity. Are you offended by my generosity? This cosmic generosity? Well, yeah, they were. They had no reason to be, but they were. And sometimes we're that way. Now, I want to tell you another little story that goes with this. But right at the end of that parable, this is where Jesus says these words. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. And many Christians, and I have to admit, as a preacher, I've probably preached this text, probably kind of leaning into the fairness thing. That is not what this is about at all. It's not about fairness. It's about unmitigated grace. Completely and totally overflowing, full-fledged grace. That's what it is. And Jesus says, look, if you're first, you're first. If you're last, you're first. If you're first, you're last. There's no difference. That's the point. It's not that one gets a better place, the other doesn't get the good place. It's that there is zero difference in the kingdom of God when someone has been bestowed grace upon them. That's all that there is. That's it. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's a true story as best as I can remember it. I may get a couple of the details wrong, and you won't know it if I did, so that's the really cool part. But I will admit that my memory, may have seen these in a little different frame and so forth, because I was a child when most of this was happening. And I remember hearing stories about this, and I remember witnessing parts of this. There was a woman named Lois, and she lived out in Winters, Texas. And Lois was a good woman. She owned a little beauty shop in Winters, and she went to church every Sunday, and every Sunday night, and every Wednesday night, and probably 13 more times throughout the week, I'm guessing, because it's a tiny town, and you can't hardly, go anywhere without passing the church building. And she was married to a man named Kavanaugh, and Kavanaugh was a great man as well. He was the fire chief in town. He, at one time, I think, was mayor of the town. He was also an elder in the church, did a little bit of preaching here and there. And he was a businessman. He owned a machine shop in Winters, Texas, but he also owned several plots of land throughout West Texas. Mainly, he bought them for the mineral rights, because he knew at some point in time the oil would, rise to the top, the cream rise to the top, so to speak, and that it would pay off. And so they were a great couple, leaders in the community, leaders in the church. And in March of 1935, they had their first child, and her name was Cavanel, named after her father, Kavanaugh, obviously the apple of his eye. They loved her. She was a beautiful little child. And over the next 12 years, they had 5 more children. So now they've got 6. But in 1952, when Cavanel, they called her Cava, when Cava was 17, Kavanaugh was out on a business trip in West Texas. He was on his way home and was hit by a semi-truck at a crossroads in West Texas, and if you've ever spent any time out there, it's no wonder. And he died. And so now Lois has 6 children that she's trying to care for, nobody to run the machine shop. She sells that off, and her oldest daughter, Cava, who's 17 now, decides she's going to quit school, and she goes to work at the beauty shop to help Lois pay the bills and take care of the other kids. And one of the other daughters, about a year later, did the same thing. And one of the other daughters was about 4 years younger than Kava. She was kind of depended on to take care of the other 3 kids, which were all boys and pretty ornery at that. And so as this begins to go on, it doesn't take long before Kava decides, she's going to get married. And she gets married to a man named John. And I don't know exactly what happened in John's life. I don't know his story that well. I don't know what life was like before they got married. I just know that they began having a family of their own, and they had 5 kids. And so now you've got 6 kids from Lois and 5 kids from Kava. And Lois is doing everything she can to hold the family together, and Kava's working pretty hard too, trying to keep the family together. And John kind of starts going off the rails, and he gets involved in some alcohol and some drugs and different things, and before long, he's in prison for burglary and several other things, like armed robbery things. And so John is in prison, and he gets out, and he comes home every now and then, and that kind of messes up the balance of this somewhat dysfunctional family anyway. And by the way, aren't we all dysfunctional? Just, throwing that out there. But the balance that you develop, when single mom is raising 5 kids and grandma is still raising 5 kids, kind of, and everybody's helping everybody else to make ends meet. And then John throws the stick in the spokes. He comes home, and it kind of upsets the balance of the family. But before long, he's arrested again, and he's back in prison again. And this happens several times throughout the years. And eventually, John's oldest son even gets involved in his criminal activities, and he ends up in prison. And every single one of those kids still today, for the most part, bear the generational curses that come with that. Some of them have done better than others, and some of them have really, really struggled, and their lives have been totally torn apart because of things set in motion by their father. Well, eventually, John gets out of prison. And Lois has been doing everything she can to help raise Kava's 5 kids. And her kids are pretty much grown by this time and out of the house. But Kava's kids aren't. And so she wants to sell the beauty shop and retire and be granny to all of her grandkids, right? But she doesn't get to. She sells the beauty shop, and she moves to Abilene, Texas, and she takes a job with the Texas State School for Special Children, which means that she's basically a house mom for a group of special needs children, and she works nights there in order to make extra money to pay the bills that John can't pay, and to take care of the kids. And the reason she does it at night is so that while Kava's working in the daytime at a beauty shop there in town, Lois can take care of the kids as much as she can, make sure they're at school and where they need to go and they have what they need and all of those sorts of things. And needless to say, the family members, the brothers and sisters of Kava, the nieces and nephews, the family friends, none of them are too fond of John for obvious reasons. But Lois loved him. She never quit loving him. And she would preach the gospel every time she got a chance. Now, she was a little tiny petite lady, and she was not the most confident woman in the world, although she knew that John was lost, and she was going to preach the gospel to John every chance she got. John didn't listen. John had pretty much given up on himself. But he had stayed out of prison and life was getting better. I only met John maybe 4 or 5 times. He was my uncle. And Lois was my grandma. We called her Granny Lois. She was the coolest granny that anybody ever had. She had a VW Bug, and we would pile like 16 grandkids in the Bug to see how many people we could pile in there. And then we would start telling jokes and try to make her laugh as hard as she could because, we were demented kids. I'm just going to say this. We knew that if she laughed hard enough, she might pee herself. And so, I'm just saying. But Granny was fun, and she was always game, man. She was willing to do whatever it took to have a good time with the kids. When she was over 70 years old, she went gliding in a glider over the Hawaiian Islands. She wasn't scared of much in life. She'd seen a lot by this time, right? Raising 6 kids of her own, 5 kids of her daughters, pretty much. And Lois probably cared for them 80 to 90% of the time. But the love she had for John was unconditional. It had to be, right? How do you not give unconditional love? How could it not be unconditional when John has basically ruined your daughter's life? He's ruined his own life. He's ruined his children's lives. And Lois was smart enough to know that it was going to take years, generations perhaps, to undo the damage that was done. But she wouldn't give up on John. And a few years later, not many, maybe 3, after he was finally out of prison for the last time, he developed cancer, and it was very aggressive. And he ended up down at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. And you may have friends that have been there. You may have been there yourself. It's one of the strongest cancer hospitals in the country, probably in the world. But John was there, and they were treating him, and there wasn't a lot they could do at this time. We've learned a lot about cancer since then, but John was on his way out, and he knew it. And Lois knew it as well. And so Granny Lois packed up her little VW Beetle every weekend, and she drove the 7 hours from Abilene to Houston, and she would stay in the hospital room so she didn't have to pay for a hotel bill. And she would preach the gospel to John every weekend. And she would drive back home to her job with the state children's school in Texas. And then on the next weekend, she would take off and she would drive down to Houston. And she did this several weeks. I don't know how long. In my mind, it was 2 or 3 months that this went on. And eventually, even though John had given up on himself, pretty much all of his family had given up on him, Lois got his attention. And she finally convinced him that God's grace was enough for even him. And she led him in a confession of Jesus being the Christ and the Son of God, and that he could forgive his sins. And then she got hold of the doctors and said, I need a place where I can baptize John. And they said, ma'am, he can't get out of the bed. And if he gets in water, it'll probably infect him. And, it's just not a good idea. And she said, I don't really care. And so she did find somebody that would take him down to the physical therapy pool in the basement of the hospital. And they put him in a lift, and she baptized my Uncle John. And many of the family members at that time said something along the lines of, it was probably a deathbed confession. And maybe that's because it was. But that wasn't really what they meant by deathbed confession. What they meant was it wasn't real. What they meant was he's probably not going to be in heaven. He probably really wasn't forgiven. After all, how could God forgive somebody for doing all of this damage to his own family, and never really had he repented in a way that the family thought he should? I never heard my mom or my dad say anything bad about John. I never heard them say anything disrespectful. And in fact, my dad was kind of like Mark Twain. Everybody loved him, and he had a conversational ability with anybody from the lowest to the highest on the totem pole, although he didn't really see people on totem poles. But Dad, I can remember treated John with the utmost of respect and as if they were old buddies, every time he saw him. But some of the people said, yeah, it couldn't have taken. And then one of my aunts even told me one time that if John was getting in heaven, she didn't want to go. And it was during a conversation that I was having with my Granny Lois about grace. We had a lot of those conversations. And she said, if John's going to be in heaven, I just don't think I want to be there. And I don't remember exactly how I said it, but I can promise you this was the gist of what I said. Well, if your attitude doesn't change, that may well be possible. She didn't like that. And I don't know if she ever changed or not. I can tell you she's still alive, and she's very, very old, so I'm guessing God is waiting. I don't know. But I never even thought about John that way, and Granny Lois never thought about John that way. Granny Lois was looking forward to the time that she got to go to heaven and see John in a glorified state, the way he was supposed to be. And she knew he was there. Granny Lois read these parables all the time. She read their Bible every day. She read them every day. That's what she would do at night as she was putting all these kids to bed. As a house mother, she would read the Bible to them and tell them these stories. And I don't know how in the world you could believe this story and live this story out if you didn't believe in an immense amount of grace. And yet, if anyone deserved to go to heaven based on their works or their love for others or their grace for others, it would have been someone like Lois Crow. But she knew that wasn't the case either, that she was only going to get in by the grace of God as well. And she grew up in a pretty legalistic group, and so did I. And she struggled with that. Have I been good enough in her later years? She died at about 87 years old, and when she was in her late 70s, early 80s, she asked me if I would preach her funeral after I had gone to seminary and stuff, and I said, Granny, I would love to do that. That would be my privilege. It'll be the hardest thing I ever do, probably, but I would love to do it. And we talked about this issue of grace, and she struggled with the idea that, is there enough grace for me? And I would try hard to explain to her, yes, and it doesn't matter how much good you've done or how much sin you've done. And she could give that grace to other people. She obviously gave it to John, but she struggled with giving it to herself. Why? I mean, does that make any sense? And yet, I'm guessing some of us sitting here today are kind of there with her. Yeah, I know grace has enough. God has enough grace for people like Sheila. Everybody loves Sheila. She's just, she's nice and she's sweet. Everybody loves Dallas. Probably God has plenty of grace for Dallas, but I don't know about me. And Granny struggled with that. And thankfully, after several conversations with me and my sister and reading books by a guy named Rubel Shelley that she always gave me after she read them, she finally began to truly trust in grace. And I did get to preach her funeral about 25 years ago, and it wasn't the hardest thing I'd ever done. It was probably the easiest thing I'd ever done. It was the most fun I've ever had at a funeral until I got to preach my dad's funeral, and that was a blast. And then I got to preach my mom's funeral, and that was a blast. Dead serious. I don't know, I'm weird, I guess. But those were awesome funerals. At every one of them, the funeral director came up to me or others and said, wow, this is the best funeral I've ever been to. And I'm thinking, you're a funeral director. You do this every day. It's fun when you're loving on somebody that's loved on you so well. It's fun when you know that person well enough to know all their sins and yet know the faith that they had and the grace. And I don't know Granny Lois's sins. Goodness, she was an angel to me. I can't imagine what sin she might have committed, but she knew her own sin. She didn't know all of mine, so it was easy for her to see me with grace. But she knew all hers. And I think that's the key, folks. We know the sin we commit. And most of us, somewhere in our deepest mind, is saying, man, if people really knew everything about me that I know about me, they would run out of this church building screaming. And that might be true. But thank God we don't know everything. We don't want to know everything. All we want to know is the blood of Christ covering each one of us and making us completely spotless and clean. And so you might be sitting here, you may be online this morning thinking, man, I'm John. Or maybe you're thinking, no, I'm not, I got this. Maybe you're thinking, I'm Lois. I hope you are. But the reality is, aren't we sometimes both? Every single one of us? Now, I want you to understand that Jesus, when he begins to tell this parable, he's saying, look, it's not based on the amount of work you did in the kingdom. Oh, I would love for you to do work in the kingdom. But the grace of God is what produces the work. It's not the other way around, that work produces grace. And so Jesus wants us to understand that, and that's what I want us to understand this morning. And honestly, I want myself to understand it better. Why would someone like Lois struggle with that? And why would somebody like John give up on himself? Well, because so many others had. And I don't know where you're at this morning. You might be sitting here thinking, man, I am never going to be able to get it together. I am never going to be able to be righteous enough. Or maybe you are thinking, no, I got this. Both of those are lies. Neither one of them are true. Jesus has got it. But if you're trying to wait until your life gets better to come to Jesus, you're waiting too long. If you're waiting until you don't need grace to come to Jesus, that day, unlike death and taxes, is never coming. You're always going to need the grace of Jesus. And so this morning, I want to encourage us that are here, those online, to truly ask yourself, do I trust this grace of Jesus enough? Maybe you've been trying to please God. You know the only way you can please God is to trust him. Literally, Scripture says that he doesn't want just your belief. He wants your trust. He doesn't want you to please him. He wants your trust. Trusting him pleases him. Paul says in Titus 2, and you'll probably hear me say this verse every time I ever preach for the rest of my life. In Titus chapter 2, grace is the thing that changes us. Grace is the only thing that's powerful enough to transform a John or a Darren. Grace is it. That's all we got. Thankfully, that's all we need. That's all we need. Now, do good works follow grace? Yes, they do. In huge amounts. And you can see that with people that you know in this church or in the community around you. So this morning, I want to offer an invitation. If you've never accepted Jesus, if you've never put Jesus on in baptism and been buried with him in the grave and been raised to a new life symbolically through that water, I want to offer that opportunity. We would happily take care of that today or sometime next week or whatever works for you. But I'd do it today if that's what you wanted. And so I'm going to pray. The band's going to come up. And then if you are thinking today's the day that you want to stop trying to get better and trust God to get you better, then I want to offer the opportunity. You can just come up to the front here on this side over here, and we will take care of whatever you need.